Welcome to the Heart's Haven. Let the story begin. A poor girl stops a millionaire's car. What she says changes everything. The city moved fast that afternoon, too fast for anyone to notice what didn't belong. Cars rushed past in polished lines of steel and glass, engines humming like a constant, restless heartbeat. People crossed streets with their heads down, eyes fixed on screens, coffee cups in hand, lives scheduled down to the minute. And then everything stopped. A black luxury sedan glided through the intersection, its paint reflecting the skyline like a mirror. It didn't slow. It didn't hesitate. Why would it? Nothing ever made it stop. Until she stepped into the road. She couldn't have been more than 8. Small, still, completely out of place in the middle of 4 lanes of traffic. Her shoes were worn, the kind that made a soft scraping sound against pavement. Her jacket hung loosely on her shoulders, too thin for the breeze that carried the faint chill of early fall. The driver slammed the brakes. Tires screeched, horns erupted behind them in sharp, angry bursts. A man shouted from a nearby sidewalk. Someone dropped a bag of groceries, apples rolling into the street. But the girl didn't move. She stood there perfectly still right in front of the car. Inside, the world was silent. Daniel Carter sat in the back seat, untouched by the chaos just inches away from him. His suit was tailored to precision, his watch gleaming under the filtered sunlight. Everything about him spoke of control, of order, of a life where nothing unpredictable was allowed to linger for long. He didn't look up at first. He rarely did. To him, the outside world was just motion background noise between meetings, numbers, decisions that shaped entire industries. People were variables, problems were solved, time was never wasted. "Sir, she ran out," the driver stammered, gripping the wheel. Daniel exhaled slowly, irritation flickering across his face like a passing shadow. "Handle it," he said, his voice calm, detached. But something unusual made him pause. The driver didn't move. The horns grew louder. The tension outside thickened, pressing against the glass like a storm waiting to break. And then Daniel looked up. Not out of concern. Not out of urgency. Just curiosity. Through the tinted window, he saw her. Not the torn edges of her sleeves. Not the dust on her shoes. Her eyes. She wasn't panicking. She wasn't begging. She wasn't even afraid. She was looking directly at him, as if she had been waiting. The kind of look that didn't ask for permission, it demanded to be seen. For a moment, just a moment, the noise outside faded. Daniel felt something unfamiliar press against the edges of his carefully ordered world. A pause. Small, quiet. Almost nothing, but enough. Because in a life where nothing ever interrupted him, this little girl just had. Daniel Carter had built a life where interruptions did not exist. The car remained still in the middle of the street, engines idling around them, horns still pressing impatiently in the distance. But inside, time stretched in a strange, unfamiliar way. Daniel's fingers rested lightly against his knee, unmoving, as he continued to look at the girl through the glass. He should have looked away. That was what he always did. Ignore, move on, stay efficient. But something about her presence refused to be dismissed. "Sir, should I call someone?" the driver asked, his voice uncertain now. Daniel did not answer right away. Instead, he reached forward and pressed the button beside him. The soft mechanical click broke the silence as the window lowered halfway, letting in the sound of the city again, louder, sharper, real. Cool air slipped inside the car, and so did her voice. "I needed you to stop." It was not loud, it was not dramatic, just simple, clear, certain. Daniel studied her more closely now. Up close, she looked even smaller than he had first thought. Her sleeves were slightly too long for her arms. A loose thread hung from the cuff, swaying gently in the breeze. There was no sign of panic in her expression, no rush in her breathing. Just patience, like she had already decided this moment would happen. "You cannot stand in traffic," Daniel said, his tone measured, controlled. "It is dangerous." The girl tilted her head slightly, as if considering his words. "I knew you would not hit me." That made him pause again. Not because of what she said, but how she said it. There was no accusation, no fear, just quiet certainty. Behind him, a horn blared louder, longer this time. Daniel ignored it. He reached into his coat pocket out of instinct, fingers brushing against his wallet. It was a reflex built over years. A solution, he understood. Quick, clean, efficient. But before he could take it out, she spoke again. "I do not want your money." His hand stopped. For a moment, he remained frozen in that half-finished motion, as if the simple sentence had disrupted something deeper than the situation itself. Most people asked. Most people needed. Most people expected. She did none of that. Daniel slowly withdrew his hand, leaving the wallet where it was. "Then what do you want?" he asked. The question came out softer than he intended. The girl took a small step closer to the car, just enough that the afternoon light caught her face more clearly. There was something steady in her gaze, something that did not match her age. "I wanted you to look at me." The words landed quietly, but they did not leave. For a second, Daniel did not respond. The noise of the street blurred again at the edges, fading into something distant and unimportant. Because the truth was, he had almost not looked. Almost. And somehow, that felt heavier than it should have. The girl held his gaze, unflinching. "I have been standing here for a long time," she continued, her voice calm, almost thoughtful. Cars kept passing, people kept looking away. A beat passed, then another. And I thought, if someone like you stopped, maybe you would actually see me. Something shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just a small, quiet fracture beneath the surface of everything Daniel believed he understood. For the first time in a very long time, he had no immediate answer. And that, more than anything, unsettled him. Daniel Carter had negotiated billion-dollar deals without hesitation. He had faced rooms full of investors, regulators, competitors, men and women who measured every word, every pause, every weakness, and he had never once felt unprepared. But standing there now, with the car idling and the city pressing in around him, he found himself searching for something as simple as the right response. And finding nothing. The girl did not rush him. She did not repeat herself. She simply stood there, waiting, as if silence itself was part of what she needed him to understand. Behind them, the line of cars had grown longer. Drivers leaned forward over their steering wheels, frustration building in the air. A delivery truck honked twice, sharp and impatient. A cyclist slowed down, watching from the edge of the street. Still, Daniel did not move. "People see you," he said finally, his voice steady again, returning to something familiar. "You are standing in the middle of the road. That is not invisible." The girl shook her head gently. "That is not the same thing." Her answer came without hesitation. "They saw a problem," she continued. "Something in their way. Not me." The distinction settled into the space between them. Daniel felt it before he fully understood it. For years, he had trained himself to see the world in terms of outcomes, efficiency, risk, value, every situation reduced to what it meant for the next step forward. He had not realized how much that way of seeing had erased everything else. The girl took another small step closer, her shoes brushing softly against the pavement. My teacher says people who are busy forget how to look, she said. They only scan. The word lingered. Scan. Daniel's mind reacted instantly, recognizing the language. Data scanning, pattern recognition, rapid filtering of information. It was the foundation of everything he had built his company on. And suddenly, it did not feel like an advantage. It felt like a limitation. "What is your name?" he asked. There was a shift in his tone now, subtle but real. The girl answered without lowering her gaze. "Lily." He nodded once, almost automatically. "Lily," he repeated, as if grounding the moment in something tangible. "You stopped my car to tell me this?" She hesitated, just for a second. Then she reached into the pocket of her jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. The edges were worn, creased from being opened and closed many times. She held it carefully, like it mattered. "I was going to give this to someone," she said, "but nobody stopped long enough." Daniel glanced at the paper, then back at her. "What is it?" "A note," she replied, "for someone who would listen." The air seemed to still again. Slowly, Daniel opened the car door. The sound of its solid, deliberate cut through the noise of the street. A few drivers lowered their horns, confused now, watching the scene unfold. Daniel stepped out onto the pavement, his polished shoes meeting the dust and scattered leaves of the road. The difference between his world and hers closed in a single movement. He stood in front of her now, not separated by glass, not removed by distance. Present. "Let me see it," he said. Lily looked at him for a moment longer, as if weighing something invisible. Then, gently, she placed the folded paper into his hand, and for reasons he could not yet explain. Daniel Carter felt like he was holding something far heavier than a single sheet of paper. Daniel Carter looked down at the folded paper resting in his hand. For a moment, he did not open it. The noise of the city pressed in again, engines humming, distant voices rising and falling, the faint rhythm of footsteps along the sidewalk. But around him, something had shifted. The urgency that once defined every second of his day felt distant, unimportant. He ran his thumb slowly along the crease of the paper, feeling how worn it was. This was not something written once and forgotten. It had been carried, held, protected, waited on. Lily stood quietly in front of him, her hands now empty, her posture unchanged. She was not watching the cars, not the people staring, only him. As if this moment had always been meant for him. Daniel unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was uneven, slightly slanted, the kind that came from small hands, still learning control. But each word had been pressed into the page with intention, as if the act of writing it mattered just as much as what it said. He read the first line, and then he stopped, not because he did not understand it, but because he did. The words were simple, no complicated language, no long explanations. Just a question that did not belong to a child standing alone in the middle of a busy street. Do you remember the last time someone listened to you without needing anything back? Daniel's breath slowed. The world around him seemed to soften, the sharp edges of sound and motion fading into something distant and blurred. He read the line again, and something inside him, something quiet, something long buried beneath years of decisions and discipline shifted. Because the answer came too quickly, and it was not one he liked. He could not remember. Not clearly. Not recently. The meetings, the contracts, the endless flow of conversations, they all had purpose, strategy, outcome. Every word exchanged was tied to something expected in return. Even kindness had structure. Even generosity had direction. Nothing was ever just given. His fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the paper. Lily's voice broke gently into the silence. My mum used to say that question helps you know who people really are. Daniel lifted his eyes slowly, looking at her again. There was no judgment in her expression, no accusation, only a quiet kind of honesty that made it harder to look away. She said, Lily continued, choosing her words carefully, that if someone cannot remember, it does not mean they are bad. A small pause. It just means they forgot how it feels. Daniel felt that, not as an idea, but as something deeper, something closer. A truth that did not argue or explain itself. It simply existed. The paper in his hand no longer felt light. It felt personal, important in a way that could not be measured or categorized. Behind him, the driver shifted slightly, uncertain whether to speak, to act, or to remain silent. But Daniel did not turn. For the first time in a very long time, he was not thinking about what came next. He was not calculating, not solving. He was standing in the middle of a street, holding a question from a little girl, and realizing that somewhere along the way he had built an entire life without ever stopping to answer it. And that realization did something unexpected. It did not break him. It opened something, slowly, quietly, but unmistakably real. Daniel Carter remained still, the paper resting open in his hand, the question echoing in a place he had not visited in years. Around him, the city had begun to adjust. Drivers leaned back in their seats, no longer honking, no longer rushing. A few pedestrians had stopped at the corners, watching quietly now, sensing that something unseen but significant was unfolding. Time had slowed, and Daniel for once did not try to speed it back up. He looked down at the note again, then back at Lily. "Why me?" he asked. The question came out softer than anything he had said before. Not defensive, not impatient, just honest. Lily shifted her weight slightly, her shoes brushing against the pavement as a faint breeze moved through the street. "I saw your car," she said simply. It looked important. Daniel almost smiled at that, but it did not quite reach the surface. "There are a lot of important cars in this city," he replied. She nodded. "But you were the only one who did not look at anyone." That landed differently. It was not criticism. It was observation. And somehow, that made it harder to ignore. Daniel glanced briefly at the glass reflection of his car door. For years, that reflection had shown him exactly what he expected to see: control, success, certainty. Now, it felt incomplete. He looked back at Lily. "You said your mother taught you that question," he said. "Where is she now?" For the first time, Lily's expression shifted not into sadness, not into fear, but into something quieter, something more thoughtful. "She is resting," Lily answered. The words were gentle, chosen carefully. Daniel understood more than she explained. He nodded once, slowly. "And you have been standing here, waiting to give that note to someone?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "How long?" She looked up at the sky for a brief second, as if measuring time differently than most people. "A while." That answer should have felt vague, but it did not. It felt accurate. Daniel let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. All at once, the structure of his day, the meetings, the schedule, the constant forward motion, felt strangely distant, like something belonging to a different version of himself. He looked down at the paper again. "Do you remember the last time someone listened to you, without needing anything back?" The words had not changed, but something inside him had. He folded the paper carefully, this time with intention, smoothing the crease with steady hands. Then he looked at Lily, not as an interruption, not as a problem, but as a person. "What happens if I say I do not remember?" he asked. Lily met his gaze without hesitation. Then maybe this is where you start. No hesitation, no doubt, just a simple truth, offered without expectation. And in that moment, standing in the middle of a city that had never once slowed down for him, Daniel Carter felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not a solution, not a plan, but a beginning. Daniel Carter stood there a moment longer, the folded paper resting securely in his hand, as if letting go of it now would undo something that had only just begun. The city slowly came back into focus around him. A crosswalk signal changed. A distant siren passed somewhere far off. A breeze carried the faint scent of roasted coffee from a nearby corner shop. Life resumed its rhythm, but Daniel no longer felt carried by it. He felt present. He glanced back at the car, then at the line of waiting vehicles behind it. His driver met his eyes briefly, unsure, waiting for direction. For once, Daniel did not give one. Instead, he turned back to Lily. "What were you going to do?" he asked gently, if no one stopped. Lily shrugged slightly, the motion small but honest. "I would have kept waiting," she said, "or I would try again somewhere else." No frustration, no complaint, just persistence. Daniel studied her face, searching for something, anything that would make her easier to understand, easier to place into a category he already knew. But she did not fit. Not into charity. Not into urgency. Not into any problem he could solve with a signature or a check. She was something else entirely. A moment. A mirror. A question he had avoided for years. "Do you have somewhere to go?" he asked. Lily nodded. "There is a library 2 blocks that way," she said, pointing down the street. "They let me sit inside when it gets quiet." Daniel followed the direction of her hand. 2 blocks, a short distance. Something he would normally measure in seconds, in convenience, in efficiency. But now, it felt like a choice. He looked back at her. "Have you eaten today?" She hesitated not long, just enough to tell the truth without saying it directly. "I had something earlier." Daniel understood that answer too. There was a time when he would have reached for his wallet again, offered something immediate, solved the surface. But that instinct no longer felt complete. Because this, whatever this moment was not about solving. It was about seeing. He took a breath, steady and deliberate. "Walk with me," he said. The words surprised even him. Not a command. An invitation. Lily looked at him, searching his face the same way he had been searching hers. Then, slowly, she nodded. Side by side, they stepped out of the road and onto the sidewalk. Behind them, the line of cars began to move again, engines rising, the city reclaiming its pace. But Daniel did not turn back. For the first time in years, he was not thinking about where he needed to be next. Only where he was. They walked in silence at first, the space between them calm, unforced. Their footsteps fell into a quiet rhythm against the concrete, steady and real. After a moment, Lily glanced up at him. "You stopped," she said softly. Daniel looked down at her, the faintest hint of something unfamiliar touching his expression. "Yes," he replied. Not because he had to, but because, for the first time in a long time, he chose to. They walked side by side along the sidewalk, the city stretching ahead of them in long lines of glass, steel, and movement. People passed without slowing, footsteps quick, conversations half-finished, lives continuing exactly as they had before. But for Daniel Carter, something had shifted. Each step felt different. Not heavier, just noticed. He became aware of small things he would have ignored before. The uneven cracks in the pavement beneath his shoes, the soft hum of traffic instead of its urgency. The way Lily walked, not rushed, not distracted, but steady, as if she had nowhere else she needed to be. It unsettled him, and grounded him at the same time. After a few steps, he spoke. "Why did you choose that question?" he asked, glancing down at her. Lily kept her eyes forward. "My mom used to ask it when people came over," she said, not out loud, just in her head. Daniel considered that. "And what did she do with the answer?" he asked. Lily thought for a moment. "She listened more," she replied. "Or less." He almost smiled again, this time just slightly. "That sounds simple." "It is," Lily said, "but most people do not like simple." Daniel let that settle. He knew she was right. His entire life had been built on complexity. Systems, strategies, layers of control designed to manage outcomes before they even happened. Simple things were often dismissed because they could not be measured. But this felt different. They reached the corner and waited as the crosswalk signal blinked from red to white. A small group gathered beside them, 2 office workers, a man with a grocery bag, a teenager scrolling through his phone. No one paid attention to them. And for the first time, Daniel noticed what that actually meant. Not being seen. The signal changed. They crossed together. Halfway across, Lily spoke again. "Do you always know what to do next?" The question came without warning. Daniel exhaled lightly. "Usually," he answered. "That is part of my job." Lily nodded. "Does it ever get tiring?" He did not answer right away. Because the truth was, yes, more than he ever admitted. "It can," he said finally. Lily glanced up at him. "My mum said, when people always know what to do, they stop asking why they are doing it." That stopped him. Not physically, but internally. Because that question why was something he had not asked himself in a long time. Not about his work, not about his choices, not about his life. They reached the other side of the street and continued walking. A bookstore sign came into view ahead. The windows were filled with quiet light, shelves lined with stories waiting to be opened. Lily pointed. "That is the place," she said. Daniel followed her gaze. 2 blocks. Just like she said. He slowed slightly as they approached, something inside him resisting the idea that this moment, this unexpected pause in his life, might be coming to an end. Because for the first time in years, he was not sure he wanted it to. He looked down at the folded paper still in his hand, then back at Lily, and realized something that felt both simple and profound. This was no longer just about a question. It was about what he chose to do with the answer. They stopped just outside the library. The building was not large, brick walls softened by time, tall windows glowing with a quiet, steady light. Inside, silhouettes moved slowly between shelves, voices low, the kind of place where the world seemed to lower its volume without being asked. Lily stood near the entrance, her eyes resting on the door, as if it were something familiar, something safe. Daniel stood beside her, still holding the folded paper. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city continued behind them, cars passing, footsteps echoing, life moving forward without pause. But here, right at the edge of the doorway, everything felt still again. "You can go in," Daniel said gently. Lily nodded, but she did not move right away. Instead, she turned to look at him. Not with urgency, not with expectation, just present. "Are you going to remember?" she asked. The question was quiet, but it carried more weight than anything she had said before. Daniel looked down at the paper in his hand, then back at her. For years, his answers had always been immediate, clear, decisive. Now, he chose something different. "I think I am starting to," he said. It was not a perfect answer, but it was honest. Lily studied his face for a second longer, as if measuring the truth behind his words. Then, slowly, she smiled. It was small, fragile, but real. "That is enough," she said. She reached for the door, her hand wrapping around the metal handle. As she pulled it open, a soft wave of warm air slipped out, carrying the scent of paper and quiet spaces. She paused just before stepping inside. "If you forget again," she added, without turning back, "you can ask the question again." Then she walked in. The door closed gently behind her. And just like that, she was gone. Daniel remained where he was. The street noise returned, filling the space she had left behind. A car passed. Someone laughed in the distance. A bus slowed at the corner. But none of it reached him the same way. He looked down at the paper once more. Carefully, he unfolded it again. The words had not changed. But he had. For the first time, he did not read the question as something abstract. He felt it, fully, quietly. And instead of folding it away quickly, instead of moving on, he slipped the paper into the inside pocket of his coat, close, deliberate, intentional, not as something to solve, but as something to carry. Daniel Carter stood there for another moment, just outside the library doors, no longer rushing toward the next meeting, the next decision, the next version of success. Because something more important had already begun. Not in a boardroom, not in a deal, but in a moment where he finally chose to see. Daniel Carter did not move right away. The door had closed, the moment had passed, and yet something remained. He stood on the sidewalk, the late afternoon light stretching longer across the street, soft shadows forming at the edges of buildings. The rush of the city continued around him, unchanged, uninterrupted. But he was no longer moving with it. For the first time in years, Daniel turned off his phone. Not silenced, not ignored, turned off. The screen went dark in his hand, and with it the constant stream of demands, updates, expectations, everything that had once defined his time. He slipped it into his pocket, next to the folded paper. Then he looked back at the library door. A simple place. Quiet. Unremarkable by every standard he had once valued. And yet, it had become the center of something he could not explain. He took a breath and stepped inside. The warmth met him first, then the stillness. Rows of books stretched out in quiet order. A librarian moved behind the desk, organizing returns with calm precision. A few people sat scattered at tables, reading, writing, existing without urgency. Daniel slowed his steps. Not because he had to, because he wanted to. He scanned the room, then caught himself, and stopped. Not scanning, looking, really looking. Near the far corner, Lily sat at a small wooden table, her feet not quite reaching the floor, a book open in front of her. Her posture was relaxed, her focus steady, as if she had always belonged there. She did not notice him. And, for once, he did not interrupt. He simply watched, not as a problem to solve, not as a responsibility, but as a person who had been given something rare, a second chance at seeing. Daniel walked quietly to a nearby table and sat down. The chair made a soft sound against the floor, but no one looked up, no one needed to. He reached into his coat and took out the paper again. This time, he did not rush to read it. He already knew the words. Instead, he held it there for a moment, letting the weight of it settle fully. Then, slowly, he leaned back in the chair and closed his eyes not to escape, but to listen. To the silence. To the space between thoughts. To something he had not allowed himself to feel in a very long time. Peace. And somewhere in that quiet, something became clear. Success had never been the problem. But it had never been the answer either. Because the real question had always been simpler. Who did you see? And who saw you? Daniel opened his eyes. Across the room, Lily turned a page, and for the first time in years, he did not feel alone.